The first thing Mae Morgan noticed about the man who rode into Dusty Creek was not his face, not his gun, not even the way his horse moved like it carried the weight of every mile it had ever crossed. It was his boots, cracked along the toes and caked with the dust of 100 different roads, the kind of boots that had never once been set beside a hearth at night. It was the spring of 1878, and Dusty Creek sat at the edge of the Texas Panhandle like a coin someone had dropped and couldn't be bothered to pick up. The town had a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, a livery stable that smelled of hay and manure and old leather, a general store that doubled as a post office, a saloon that never fully closed, a small Baptist church with a cracked bell, and a boarding house run by a widow named Clara Fitch. Mae ran the boarding house with Clara, had done so for 3 years since her parents had passed within 6 months of each other. Her father to a rattlesnake bite that went septic, her mother to a grief that dressed itself up as pneumonia. Mae was 24 years old, capable and steady-handed, and she had long since learned how to keep her face composed even when her heart was doing something inconvenient. She was sweeping the front porch of the boarding house when the man rode in. He came from the south, from the direction of the dry flats where the mesquite grew in stubborn tangles. His horse was a dark bay, road-weary but well cared for. The animal's coat was dusty, but its shoes were good, and it held its head up with the particular dignity of a horse that had been treated with some decency. The man himself was somewhere in his late 20s, lean and sun-darkened, with dark brown hair that had grown too long beneath his hat and a jaw that needed a razor's attention. He wore a plain canvas duster and rode with an ease that was not laziness but something older, something built into the spine of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it. He stopped in front of the livery stable, dismounted without hurry, and spoke quietly to Ned the liveryman. Mae stopped sweeping and watched. She was not a woman given to staring, but there was something about this man that made her pause, a quality she could not name yet, something in the unhurried way he moved, in the slight downward cast of his eyes when he handed over the reins. Clara Fitch appeared at the screen door behind her. Clara was 61 years old, round-faced and sharp-eyed, with white hair she pinned up severely every morning as if it were a task that required discipline. "New rider," Clara observed, squinting down the porch. "Yes, ma'am," Mae said. "Looks tired." "Looks like more than tired," Mae said. Clara made a small sound of consideration. "Well, if he's looking for a room, we've got the one at the end of the hall. Roof doesn't leak any more since you fixed the shingles." Mae nodded and went back to her sweeping, but she kept watch from the corner of her eye. The man spent a few minutes talking to Ned, then pulled a saddlebag from the horse's back, just one, light enough to carry in one hand, and walked toward the boarding house with the careful, slightly stiff walk of someone who had been in the saddle too long. He came up the porch steps and removed his hat. His eyes were dark, a deep brown that was almost black, and they moved around the space with a kind of practiced attention, taking in the chairs, the windows, the door, the way a man looks at a place when he is figuring out its exits as much as its comforts. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was low and even, no particular accent to place it precisely, though there was the faint echo of somewhere southern in it, softened by years of moving. "Afternoon," Mae said. She leaned the broom against the wall and folded her hands in front of her. "Looking for a room? If you've got one." "We do. It's $1 a week, meals included. Breakfast at 7, supper at 6. You miss it, you find yourself something from what's in the kitchen, but you don't make a mess." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to a smile, something caught it partway and held it there, so it was more of a ghost of one. "That's fair," he said. "How long will you be staying?" He looked past her for a moment, out at the street, at the wide sky above the rooftops. "Not long," he said. "A few days, maybe a week." Mae studied him for a moment, not rudely, but with the frank assessment of a woman who had learned to read guests quickly, who had learned which men would cause trouble and which would not. This man, she thought, would not cause trouble of the aggressive kind. Whatever trouble he carried was the kind he kept entirely to himself. "Name?" she asked. "Cyrus Hadley." She wrote it in the ledger. "I'm Mae Morgan. I manage this house along with Mrs. Fitch. You need anything within reason, you ask either of us. You bring liquor to your room, you drink it quiet. No gambling at the supper table, no spurs in the parlor." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and this time the ghost of a smile had a little more warmth to it. She showed him to the room at the end of the hall. It was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the side yard where her kitchen garden grew in its neat spring rows, a narrow iron bed with a blue quilt, a washstand, a small writing desk, and a hook on the wall for hanging things. She had put fresh candles in the holder on the desk 2 days ago. "Water's in the pitcher," she said. "I'll heat more if you want a proper wash." He set his saddlebag on the desk and looked around the room with that same quiet attention, and Mae noticed something she had not quite registered before. He still had his hat on. That was reasonable. Men kept their hats on all kinds of places. But he had also not moved to sit down on the bed, had not reached to pull off his boots the way every other traveler she had ever housed did within 30 seconds of arriving in a room with a place to sit. He just stood there, in the middle of the small room, as if the act of settling himself required a kind of permission he hadn't yet decided to grant. She said nothing about it. It was not her business. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and left him there. That evening at supper there were 4 boarders at the long table. Old Mr. Beaumont, who was a retired surveyor and had lived in the house for 2 years and had opinions about everything. The Kendrick brothers, Samuel and Pete, who were in town doing some kind of fencing work on one of the ranches outside of town. And Cyrus Hadley, who sat at the end nearest the door and ate what was put in front of him, a good thick beef stew with cornbread, with the methodical attention of a man who was eating because the body requires fuel rather than because the food particularly interested him. Mae ate in the kitchen with Clara, as was her habit, so she observed the supper table through the pass-through window while she ate. Mr. Beaumont talked at length about the proposed route of the Southern Pacific Railroad and what it would mean for towns like Dusty Creek. The Kendrick brothers listened politely and said, "Is that right?" at intervals. Cyrus Hadley said nothing at all unless directly addressed, and when he was, his answers were short and polite and complete, and then he went back to his stew. "Quiet one," Clara murmured, appearing at Mae's shoulder with a coffee cup. "Yes," Mae agreed. "The quiet ones are either the easiest guests or the most complicated," Clara said, with the wisdom of a woman who had been running a boarding house for 15 years. "I know," Mae said, and Clara raised an eyebrow at her and went back to the stove. The next morning, Mae was in her kitchen garden before 6, when the light was still thin and pink along the eastern horizon, and the air had that brief perfect coolness it would lose by 8 o'clock. She was checking her pea vines, which had climbed the twine she had strung for them with the enthusiastic ambition of all growing things, when she heard the back door of the house open. Cyrus Hadley came out with a coffee cup in his hand. He was wearing the same canvas duster and his boots were still on. He stopped short when he saw her. "Morning," he said. "Morning, Mr. Hadley. Coffee's on the stove inside if you want more." "I helped myself," he said, slightly carefully as if he wasn't certain this was permitted. "That's what it's there for," she said. "Early risers can always help themselves." He came down the back steps and stood at the edge of the garden. He looked at the pea vines, at the rows of beans just coming up, at the onions and the radishes already making themselves apparent. "Nice garden," he said. "Thank you. It's what feeds this house half the year." He nodded. He looked out at the back of the lot, where a cottonwood tree grew beside the fence, its new leaves catching the early light and making it silver green. He drank his coffee. He did not seem to feel the need to fill the silence, which Mae appreciated, because she had met too many men in her life who seemed terrified of a quiet moment and would talk just to prevent one. They stood there in companionable silence for a while, watching the morning come in over the rooftops of Dusty Creek. A rooster somewhere across town made its daily proclamation. The sky went from pink to gold to the particular bright clear blue that characterized Texas spring mornings. "You come from far?" Mae asked, not because it was her business but because the question came naturally, the way questions do in early morning quiet. He was quiet for a moment. "West of here," he said. "Before that north, before that a few other places." "You traveling for work or just traveling?" He considered this with more seriousness than she had expected. "Both, I suppose," he said at last. "I do work where I find it. Fencing, ranch handwork, driving cattle when there's a drive, whatever's needed. And then you move on." It wasn't quite a question, but he answered it like one. "And then I move on," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, not bitterness, not defiance, but something resigned, something that had made its peace with a fact it didn't particularly enjoy. Mae thought about that. She thought about a life conducted entirely out of a single saddlebag, sleeping in different rooms every few weeks, eating at different tables, knowing nobody's name long enough for it to matter. She thought it sounded exhausting in a way that went beyond the body. "Well," she said, "breakfast will be ready in an hour. There's eggs from the Havorson farm and I've got good bacon." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back inside, and Mae went back to her pea vines. He stayed a week. Then, at the end of that week, when Mae sat with the ledger and expected him to settle up and ride, he asked instead if he could stay another week. He had found work with the Halloran Ranch. He said they needed some help repairing a corral and then moving a small herd of cattle to a different pasture. It would be 2 more weeks at most. "Of course," Mae said, and wrote it in the ledger. She noticed during those weeks a number of things about Cyrus Hadley. She noticed that he was unfailingly quiet and courteous at the supper table, but that when old Mr. Beaumont said something particularly mulish, which happened often, there was a flicker in his dark eyes that was unmistakably dry amusement. She noticed that he was up before everyone else every morning, and that he always cleaned up whatever he had used in the kitchen. She noticed that he was good with her horses. She kept 2 horses in the stable, a gray mare named Dot and a dun gelding named Persimmon, and Cyrus had begun without asking or announcing it to check their feet and their feed when he went to tend his own horse. And one afternoon she had found him quietly brushing Dot, who had an old injury that made her touchy about being handled, and Dot was standing there soft and relaxed under his hands like he had known her for years. She noticed that he never at any point took his boots off, not at the supper table, not on the porch in the evenings. Not as far as she could tell, and she was not trying to tell, she was simply observant at any other time. He went to bed in them as far as she could tell. She had never once heard the familiar thump of boots being set beside a bed. She told herself this was no concern of hers and went about her business. At the end of the 2nd week, he again asked if he might stay on. The Halloran work had extended. Mae said yes, and now the 2 weeks became a month, and the month developed its own rhythms, and those rhythms began to include things Mae had not anticipated. It began with the porch. Dusty Creek's evenings in late spring were golden and mild, and Mae had a habit of sitting on the front porch after supper with a cup of coffee, or sometimes a small glass of apple brandy, watching the street settle into its nighttime quiet. One evening Cyrus came out and stood at the porch railing, and she asked if he wanted to sit, meaning it as pure hospitality, the same she would have offered any boarder. He sat and they talked for a while about nothing in particular, the weather, the state of the road south, whether the Baptist church was going to get its bell fixed, and then it was dark and the stars were out and they were still talking. After that, it became a habit. Most evenings after supper, they found themselves on the porch. Sometimes Mr. Beaumont joined them and held forth on various subjects, and then it was more audience than conversation. But when it was just the 2 of them, there was something that grew between the words, something that had nothing to do with what they were actually saying and everything to do with the way they said it, the way they leaned in the same direction when the wind came from the south, the way they both went quiet at the same moments. Mae was not a woman who confused herself about her own feelings. She had been in love once before, at 19, with a rancher's son named James who had been handsome and lively, and who had eventually gone to Kansas for reasons he explained at length in a letter she had received 3 weeks after his departure, a letter that she had read twice, and then used to start the kitchen stove. She knew what the particular warmth in her chest meant when she heard Cyrus's step on the porch stairs. She did not encourage it. But she did not discourage it either, because honestly it had been a long time since her chest had done anything particularly interesting, and it seemed unwise to be ungrateful. She began to notice more things. That when he was working, he had a quality of focused attention that was almost beautiful to watch, nothing wasted, nothing hurried, just steady, considered effort. That he had read more books than most men she had met, because sometimes in the evenings he would say something that was clearly informed by a different kind of knowing, the kind that comes from reading in the quiet hours. She found him once in the parlor with one of Clara's old novels, reading with the careful absorption of someone who was genuinely elsewhere for a while. And he looked up, and his face had the unguarded quality of someone caught in a moment of pure simple pleasure. And Mae's chest did something quite dramatic, and she went into the kitchen at speed and spent 15 minutes organizing things that didn't need organizing. Clara, who had been watching all of this from the excellent vantage point of a woman who had been alive a long time and paid close attention to people, said nothing for several weeks, and then one morning over coffee said simply, "He's a good man." "He's a boarder," Mae said. "Those two things can coexist," Clara said pleasantly, and poured herself more coffee. It was a Tuesday in early June, about 6 weeks after Cyrus had ridden into Dusty Creek, when Mae asked him about the boots. They were on the porch, later than usual because the night was particularly warm and beautiful, the sky thick with stars and a half-moon throwing silver light over the rooftops. The Kendrick brothers had moved on to another job 2 weeks ago. Mr. Beaumont had retired early. It was just the two of them, and Mae had the apple brandy out, and they had been talking for a long time about a dozen different things, and there was a comfortable closeness to the evening that made Mae brave. She looked down at his boots. They were the same pair he had ridden in with, resoled recently. She had seen him at the cobbler's shop on Main Street the week before, but the same worn, much-traveled leather. She had never, not once in 6 weeks, seen them off his feet. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask," he said, which she had come to learn was his way of saying yes without overpromising. "When is the last time you took your boots off?" He was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at his feet, at the worn leather, and something crossed his face that was complicated and layered, something that had clearly been sitting inside him for a long time. "6 months, I suppose," he said. Mae kept her face composed, though she wanted to say a number of things. "6 months," she repeated. "About that. That's a long time." "I suppose it is." She waited. She had learned that Cyrus Hadley would say more if given the space to say it, but that he required that space, that he couldn't be pushed toward a thing, only given room to arrive there himself. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "If you're always ready to leave," he said at last slowly, feeling his way through the words, "then leaving isn't as hard." Mae absorbed that. She thought she understood it on the surface, a man who lived in motion, who moved from place to place, who kept himself perpetually ready for the next road. But she thought there was more to it than the practical, and she said so gently. "There's more to it than that, I think," she said. He looked at her. In the moonlight his face was very still. "There's nowhere worth staying," he said. "That's the plain truth of it. I've been in a lot of places. I've never found a place where I thought, this is where I want to be. This is what I want to wake up to every morning and what I want to see when I go to sleep at night." He paused. "So I keep moving. And the boots stay on because taking them off means settling in somewhere, means it being a home for a little while. And if it isn't going to be a home, there's not much point." Mae was quiet for a long moment. She looked out at the street, at the moonlit dust, at the dark shapes of the buildings across the way. She thought about what it must be to move through the world like water moving through a landscape, never pooling, never staying, always on toward the next contour of the land. "You've been moving a long time?" she asked. "Since I was 20, he said. 8 years. What happened when you were 20? Another long pause. She could see him deciding whether to answer. He was 28, she had gathered from various things he had said, though he hadn't stated his age outright. She had pieced it together. "My father's farm," he said. "In Arkansas, we lost it. Debt, bad years, bad luck, and a banker who wasn't inclined toward patience. My father, he didn't take it well. My mother had already passed the year before. When we lost the farm, my father he stopped. He looked at his hands. He gave up. Within a year, I don't know what else to call it. He just stopped wanting to be alive, and eventually his body agreed with him." Me's heart tightened. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That's a terrible kind of loss." "It was a long time ago," he said, "but not in the way people say things are a long time ago when they mean they don't hurt anymore. More in the way people say it when they have learned to carry the hurt at a steady enough distance to function. After that," he continued, "there wasn't anything to go back for. The farm was gone. There was just out here, the territory, work enough to keep you fed if you were willing to move toward it." He looked up at the sky. "I learned early that settling in meant losing things. So it seemed better not to settle." Me thought of her own particular losses. Her father dying in slow agony from a snake bite that should have been treated sooner, but there hadn't been a doctor within 30 miles. Her mother fading month by month after that. The two of them dying with such similar exhausted quietness that it still ached in the middle of her chest when she thought about it in the wrong kind of moment. She thought about how she had responded to those losses in the exact opposite way Cyrus had, by planting herself here, by digging in, by putting her hands in the earth of this kitchen garden and making something grow. "I understand it," she said, "protecting yourself that way." He looked at her. "I just think," she said carefully, "that you might be carrying those boots like a kind of armor, and armor is heavy to wear all the time." He was very still for a moment, and she thought she might have gone too far, might have reached too far into a private thing. But then he said, "You're not wrong," quietly, and the two words carried an enormous weight of acknowledgement in them. They sat with that for a while, with the stars overhead and the quiet street in front of them and the night air warm around them. After a while, Me poured them both a small measure more of the apple brandy, and they talked about other things, lighter things, easier things, but something had shifted between them, like a door that had been closed politely and now stood at least partially open. That night, Me lay in her own bed and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. Over the following week, something changed in the nature of their evening conversations. It was not that they talked about difficult things every night. They didn't, but having talked about them once, having established that they were people who could talk about real things, the conversations took on a different quality. There was more ease in them, more willingness to say something true instead of something merely pleasant. Cyrus, she discovered, had a particular sense of humor that was entirely dry and quiet and would catch her completely off guard. He would say something apparently ordinary, and then there would be a slight lift at the corner of his mouth, and she would realize she had just been made to laugh by something she hadn't seen coming. She liked it enormously. She had a quick sense of humor herself, verbal and more obvious, and the combination of the two of them had produced, once or twice, conversations that left her genuinely gasping with laughter, which Clara had observed from behind the screen door with the satisfied expression of someone watching a theory prove out. Cyrus, meanwhile, was clearly doing his own noticing. Me would look up sometimes and find his eyes on her, not in any way that was improper or presumptuous, but with a steady, careful quality, as if he were learning something by heart. It made her feel things she did not try to suppress, because suppressing them had never been particularly effective. He began helping with the boarding house in small ways, things she had not asked for. The front porch step that had developed a worrying flex, he repaired on a Saturday morning without saying anything about it, just did it and put the tools away. He fixed the latch on the garden gate that had been giving her trouble for months. When the dun gelding persimmon threw a shoe, Cyrus had already noticed and had arranged with the blacksmith to come out the next morning. "You don't have to do all this," Me told him one afternoon, watching him recork the gap where wind came through the parlor window. "I know I don't," he said, in a tone that very plainly meant he intended to keep doing it. "I'll take it off the rent," she said. "You will not," he said. She opened her mouth to argue, and he looked at her with those dark eyes, and she decided not to argue about it right now and would revisit the point later, which she never did because it kept not feeling necessary. Clara took her aside one evening and said, "That man is not going to leave." "He said he will," Mae said. "What people say and what the rest of them is saying are two different things. That man's whole body has changed since he got here. He's not sitting with one eye on the door anymore." Mae thought about this. She was not sure Clara was right. She was not sure Clara was wrong. She was profoundly uncertain about all of it, which was not a state she was comfortable in. But then something happened that unsettled the whole quiet equilibrium of the thing. It was a Sunday, and Mae had driven out to the Havorson farm to collect eggs and a wheel of cheese from Gertrude Havorson, which was a weekly arrangement. She was 3 miles outside of town on the return, the wagon rolling steady on the dry road, when a man on horseback came up fast behind her. She turned and felt immediate unease. The man was riding too fast for passing by, and he had the look of someone with a purpose that was not friendly. He pulled alongside her and reached for her horse's bridle, which was a terrifying thing to have someone do to a moving wagon. "Slow down," he said, and he was not a man she knew. He was rough-faced, with small pale eyes and the smell of liquor coming off him even at a distance. Mae did not slow down. She flicked the reins and said sharply to the horse, and the horse, a practical animal, surged forward. The man cursed and gave chase for a moment, and then there was the sound of another horse fast, coming from the direction of town, and she looked back and saw Cyrus Hadley at a full gallop. He came between her and the rough-faced man with the calm efficiency of someone performing a task they had thought out ahead of time, though there had been no time to think. He said something to the man in a voice she couldn't hear from the wagon, and the man seemed to reconsider whatever his plans had been and wheeled his horse around and went back the way he had come. Cyrus watched him go until he was well down the road, and then turned his horse and came up alongside Mae's wagon. She had stopped the wagon. Her hands were steady on the reins, but her heart was going rather fast. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "How did you know?" "I was coming out to see if you needed help with the load," he said. "Saw him riding up behind you." His jaw was set and his eyes were still watching the direction the man had gone. "Do you know him?" "No," she said. "I've never seen him. He's been in the saloon the last few days. He'll be trouble for someone eventually. I'll tell the sheriff." He looked back at her. "Are you sure you're all right?" "I'm sure," she said. And then, because she was shaking a little despite herself, she said, "I would be more all right if someone were to ride back to town alongside me." He moved his horse to ride beside the wagon without a word. They rode in silence for a while, but it was a different kind of silence than usual, charged, warm, close. The afternoon sun was long and golden, and it lit the road ahead of them in amber and made everything look like something from a painting. "Thank you," Mae said. "Anyone would have done the same," he said. "They might have," she said, "but you were the one who did." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I didn't like the thought of you being frightened." It was said simply, with no ornamentation, but it landed with the full weight of what it actually meant, and Mae felt it land. She looked over at him. His profile in the afternoon light was very fine, she thought, not handsome in a showy way, but the kind of face you could look at for a long time without it ever being less interesting. She felt something definite and specific in her chest, something she had been feeling for weeks but had been content to leave unnamed, and she named it now in the privacy of her own thoughts, and felt simultaneously better and more frightened for having done so. She was in love with Cyrus Hadley. She was in love with a man who had told her himself that he never stayed anywhere, that he kept his boots on because there was nowhere worth staying. She was in love with a man who was preparing, she had no doubt, to saddle that dark bay horse one morning and ride away from Dusty Creek just as he had ridden away from everywhere else. She resolved to be sensible about it. Sensible lasted approximately 2 more days. It was a Wednesday evening and they were on the porch, and the conversation had gone quiet in that comfortable way it did sometimes, and the night was very soft, and Cyrus said, without looking at her, "I've been here 2 months." "You have," Mae agreed. "That's the longest I've stayed anywhere in 8 years." Mae was quiet. He turned his head and looked at her. "I keep finding reasons to stay," he said. "The Halloran work is done. There's no particular reason left except," he stopped. "Except," she said, and her voice was admirably steady, "except that when I think about saddling up and riding south, there's something that feels wrong about it, something that feels like going in the wrong direction." He was looking at her with those dark eyes, entirely unguarded now in a way that she found devastating. "I don't know what to do about that." Mae had a number of things she could have said. She said the true one. "I don't want you to go," she said. The porch was very quiet. Down the street someone played a harmonica somewhere, a slow and wandering tune. The stars were enormous overhead. "Me," he said, and her name in his voice was something she wanted to hear again immediately and for a long time. "I know what you told me," she said. "I know what you said about not staying. I'm not asking you to promise me anything. I'm just telling you the truth of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The truth of it for me is that I think about you all the time, every hour of the day. Every time you come around the corner into a room I'm in, I feel something I haven't felt since I was a young man on a farm that still had a future, and that terrifies me." "Why?" she said softly. "Because I've lost everything I've loved," he said. "The farm, my parents, the whole idea of a home. Everything I've ever settled into has been taken away, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to lose something again." Mae looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it meant to be afraid of love because love meant loss, because roots meant something to be pulled up. She thought about how she had kept going after her own losses, not because she was braver than him, but because she had channeled the fear differently into the physical act of staying and building and growing. She said, "I've lost things too. My parents, the plans I had when I was younger. I know what it is to have the ground go out from under you." She paused. "But I think the answer to that isn't to never stand on ground. I think the answer is to find ground worth standing on." He looked at her steadily for a long moment. The harmonica down the street had stopped. "Do you think that's what this is?" he asked. "Ground worth standing on." "I think you know the answer to that," she said. "I think you've known it for a while and you've been deciding what to do about knowing it." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His hand was rough from work and warm, and it covered hers completely, and Mae's heart did something enormous and entirely undisciplined. "I don't know how to be the kind of man who stays," he said. "I've forgotten how." "I think you're relearning it," she said, and turned her hand over to hold his properly. He looked down at their joined hands. Then he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen from him before, open, undefended, wide as the sky above them, and quietly, thoroughly desperate in the best possible way. "Me," he said. "Cyrus," she said. And then they stopped talking for a while, because he leaned forward and so did she. And the kiss was unhurried and warm and tasted of coffee, and something that she thought might be 6 months of loneliness finally coming to its end. Clara Fitch, peering through the screen door, made a small sound of triumph and went back to her embroidery. In the days that followed, Dusty Creek had the particular character of a small town that has noticed something developing and has opinions about it. Gossip traveled in Dusty Creek the way creek water travels, finding every low spot, filling every available channel. People noticed that Mae Morgan was spending her evenings on the porch with the long-staying boarder from Arkansas. People noticed that she was smiling more. People noticed that he looked at her like a man who had found something he hadn't been looking for and didn't know what to do about how good it was. The opinions were various. Mrs. Tanner at the general store thought it was lovely and told me so directly and at length. Old Judge Preston, who had known Mae's father, watched Cyrus from beneath his hat brim with the skeptical consideration of a man who took his time about things. The Reverend Dokes simply smiled with the benevolent patience of someone who had seen a lot of love start and had learned to appreciate it every time. What mattered more to me than any of the town's opinions was what was happening between them. The slow, careful business of learning each other, of getting close not just in the evening porch conversations, but in a dozen daily small moments. In the mornings in the kitchen, when Cyrus would appear for coffee and stand in companionable silence while she made biscuits, occasionally making some dry observation about the day ahead that made her laugh into the flour. On Sunday afternoons, when he had taken to accompanying her on her weekly drive out to the Havorson farm, and the drives had extended considerably because they were in no particular hurry to get anywhere and back. In the evenings when they sat close enough on the porch that she could feel the warmth of him beside her in the cooling air, he had not taken his boots off. He still hadn't, but she noticed things changing, small things, accumulative things. He had begun putting his saddlebag in the wardrobe instead of leaving it on the desk, which was the first time in however many weeks that it had not been within immediate reach. He had bought a second pair of trousers from the dry goods store and hung them on the hook beside the first pair, which was not the behavior of a man who was planning to leave next week. He had asked Ned the liveryman if he could rent the small pasture behind the stable for a reasonable monthly rate, to give his horse better grazing than the stable lot, not the sort of arrangement you make for a short stay. Mae noticed all of these things and said nothing about any of them, because they made her quietly and deeply happy, and she didn't want to speak them aloud in case speaking them aloud changed them somehow. Then one afternoon in late June, a letter arrived for Cyrus Hadley at the post office. Mae knew about it because the postmaster, Mr. Crisp, mentioned it in passing when she collected the boarding house mail, and she carried it back and set it on the hall table where the boarder's mail was always left. She did not think about it particularly until she saw Cyrus pick it up that evening, look at the return address somewhere in Arkansas, she noticed, and then take it to his room and not come to supper. She knocked on his door an hour later with a covered plate. "You missed supper," she said, when he opened the door. His face was carefully arranged in its usual composed way, but she knew his face well enough now to read what was underneath, and underneath the composure there was something heavy and old. "Thank you," he said, and took the plate. She waited. He stepped back from the door, which was its own kind of invitation. He sat on the bed, boots still on, and set the plate on the desk and then sat looking at the letter on the desktop beside it. "Bad news?" she asked. "Old news," he said. "My uncle in Arkansas, he's dying, he wants me to come back." Mae sat down in the desk chair. "Are you close with him?" "We were," Cyrus said. "He's my father's brother. He helped us on the farm when I was growing up. After everything went wrong, he stopped. He was the one who found my father, after. He was the one who wrote to me after." A pause. "I haven't been back to Arkansas since the day I left." 8 years, Mae said. 8 years, he confirmed. She sat with the weight of that, with what it would mean to be asked to return to the place where everything had come apart, where the worst losses had happened, where the version of yourself who believed in permanence had been dismantled. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He looked at her. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Do you want to go?" He was very quiet. "I want to see him," he said at last. "He's old and he's dying and he was good to me and I owe him that. But going back there means," he shook his head, "I haven't been ready." "You might never feel ready," Mae said gently. "That's not usually how it works." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. She stood up. She put her hand on his shoulder lightly, briefly, and felt the tension in it, the old held-in weight of a man carrying something for a very long time. "You should go," she said. "You should go see him and do what needs to be done and come back." He looked up at her sharply at the last part. "Come back," he said. Mae was quiet for a moment. She had said it without quite meaning to, but having said it, she found she meant it very much. "If you want to," she said. "There's a room at the end of the hall. The roof doesn't leak." He looked at her for a long time. Something in his face had shifted, something that had been wound tight had let go slightly. "Mae," he said. "You don't have to decide anything right now," she said. "You just need to go see your uncle." She picked up the letter from the desk and placed it back in his hands. "Write back tonight so he knows you're coming. I'll pack you some food for the road." He looked down at the letter and then back up at her, and she saw it in his face again, that open, unguarded expression, the one that was devastating in the best way. "I'll come back," he said. Not a question this time. A statement. "I know," she said, and went to make food for the road. He left on a Friday morning early, before the town was fully awake. Mae was up before him, which was saying something, and she had a saddlebag of food packed: cornbread, smoked meat, dried apples, a paper twist of coffee beans, and she brought it out to where he was saddling the dark bay in the cool morning dark. He tied the bag to the saddle and then turned to her, and they stood close together in the gray pre-dawn light, close enough that she could see the lines of his face clearly, every detail of it. "I'll be back in 4 weeks," he said. "Maybe 5. "I'll be here," she said. He put his hand against her face. It was warm, that rough, careful hand, and she turned into it slightly, the way you lean into warmth. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was the most complete and honest thing she had ever seen on a person's face. "I have never wanted to come back to a place before," he said. "I want to come back here." She kissed him, brief and warm, and said, "Then do." He mounted and rode east, and Mae stood on the porch watching until the dust settled back onto the road, and there was nothing left to watch. And then she went inside and put the coffee on and got on with things, because she was someone who got on with things. The 4 weeks passed. They were not the hardest weeks Mae had ever lived through. She had lived through worse. But they had a particular quality of waiting to them that she had not experienced before, a kind of low hum beneath all her daily work, a constant awareness of a person-shaped absence. She planted more of the garden. She repainted the parlor, which had needed it for 2 years. She had long conversations with Clara, who was wise and practical and did not pretend that love was simple or that waiting was easy, but who had strong opinions about its value. "He'll come back," Clara said, one evening after 3 weeks had passed. "I think so too," Mae said. "Are you sure enough to be afraid of it?" Mae considered. "Yes," she said. Clara nodded. "Good. Fear means it matters. You should be scared of things that matter." The letter arrived on the 25th day. It was brief. Cyrus was not a man of letters, quite literally, but it told her what she needed to know. His uncle was more ill than the letter had indicated, but was still present, still himself enough to talk. He, Cyrus, had gone back to the farm, which was now owned by someone else, some family named Prentice, and had stood at the edge of the property and looked at it and felt something shift in him, something old and knotted loosen. He expected to be back in Dusty Creek by the end of the next week. He had signed it simply, "Come back soon." Mae read it 3 times and then put it in the drawer where she kept important things. He rode back into Dusty Creek on a Thursday afternoon in July, and Mae heard the horse before she saw him. She was in the kitchen garden, and she heard the particular rhythm of a well-known horse on the road, and she stood up from the beans and shaded her eyes, and there he was, coming up the main street from the east. She did not run. She was a composed and dignified woman. She walked. She walked at a pace that she was aware was considerably faster than her normal walking pace. He had dismounted in front of the livery before she got there, and he turned when he heard her footsteps on the packed earth, and the expression on his face when he saw her was the kind of expression that makes a person's whole chest go bright and warm and certain. He looked different. She couldn't have said exactly how. Something in his bearing, something about the way he was standing. Less coiled, less ready to bolt. There was something in his face that had let go. "You came back," she said, which was obvious, and she said it anyway. "I came back," he agreed, and stepped forward and put his arms around her, and she put hers around him, and they stood like that in the afternoon sunlight in front of the Dusty Creek livery stable, which was not a particularly romantic backdrop, but did not seem to matter at all. He smelled of road dust and horse in the outdoors, and she held on to him and felt the solidness of him, the realness of him, and felt enormously glad. "How was it?" she asked, against his shoulder. "Hard," he said. "Good, both." A pause. "I took my boots off when I slept at my uncle's house." Mae pulled back enough to look at his face. He was looking at her with that open, steady expression she had come to know so well. "How was that?" she asked. "Strange," he said, "but not bad, not as terrible as I'd imagined." She laughed, and the laugh had relief in it and joy. "I sat with him the whole last week," Cyrus said. "He died 4 days ago, quietly in his sleep. I buried him beside his wife on his property." He paused. "He told me just before he got too tired to talk much, he said my father would have wanted me to find somewhere to be, somewhere that felt like mine." He looked at her steadily. "He'd have liked you. He always had good judgment." Me took his hand. "Come inside," she said. "Clara made apple cake and it's been waiting since Monday." He laughed, a real laugh, fuller than she had usually heard from him. Something loosened in it, and he went to speak to Ned about the horse, and me went back to the boarding house with something glowing in her chest that she did not try to moderate or contain. That evening on the porch, they talked for a long time. He told her about the farm, about seeing it after 8 years, the way the Prentice family had changed things, the way the land itself had remained stubbornly itself beneath all the changes. He told her about the grave where both his parents lay, which he had also visited, and how it had been terrible and necessary, and how he had stood there for a long time and said the things he had been carrying for 8 years and felt something leave him when he did. He told her about his uncle's house, which was modest and simple and had been full of the particular sweetness of a long and small and well-lived life. And then he said, "I don't want to drift any more." Me waited. "I want to stay here," he said. "If you'll have me, not just as a boarder." He looked at her and his face was very serious and also, beneath the seriousness, enormously warm. "I know I haven't given you much reason to believe I'm a man who stays, but I want to be. I want to be someone who stays." Me looked at him in the warm July evening. She thought about all the weeks she had spent watching this man slowly, carefully, choosing this place. She thought about the pea vines in the garden, how they climbed the twine she strung for them willingly, enthusiastically, once they had something to hold to. "I'll have you," she said. And then, because she was precise about language, she added, "I've been wanting to say that for about 2 months." He laughed. She laughed. He reached over and took her hand the way he had that first time, covering it entirely with his, and she held on. "I'll need to find work," he said. "I can't just keep fixing your porch steps." "Though you're very good at it," she said. "I'm serious. I won't just the Halloran Ranch," me said. "Bill Halloran told me 3 weeks ago he was looking for a foreman, someone to manage the hands and the cattle through the season and beyond. He said he'd been impressed with you. I told him you might be persuadable." Cyrus looked at her. "You told him that 3 weeks ago." "I had some information," she said with composure. He shook his head, but he was smiling in a way that was fuller and more unguarded than any smile she had seen from him before. "You were sure I'd come back." "I was hopeful," she said. "There's a difference." He brought her hand up and held it against his jaw, warm, slightly rough, real, and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and me felt something settle into its right place in her chest, something that had been waiting to arrive there for a long time. "Mae Morgan," he said. "Cyrus Hadley," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "I would like to ask you to walk out with me on Sundays, and I would like to bring you wildflowers when I find them, and I would like to do all the things a man is supposed to do when he's found the woman he intends to spend the rest of his life making things right for." She felt the warmth of that move through her like sunlight through good, clean water. "I would like that very much," she said. The summer deepened into its full, dry heat, and Dusty Creek settled into the comfortable awareness of two people finding their way toward each other with all the intention and pleasure of people who have been paying close attention. Cyrus went to speak to Bill Halloran at the ranch the following Monday, and came back that evening with the job secured foreman through the fall roundup, and if things went well, a permanent position through the year. He was still boarding at the boarding house, sleeping in the room at the end of the hall, but there was a quality to his presence in the house now that was different, fuller, more invested, less transient. He had stopped sitting with his back to the door. And one evening, Me was walking past his room with a stack of clean linens when she heard something that stopped her in the hallway, a small, ordinary sound. 2 small thumps, one after the other, the unmistakable sound of boots being set beside a bed. She stood in the hallway for a moment, the linens in her arms, and felt her eyes go warm. She went on down the hall without saying anything and put the linens in the closet and went back to the kitchen where Clara was sitting with her embroidery and sat down and said nothing at all. Clara looked up. She took one look at me's face and said, "Ah," with tremendous satisfaction. "Well then." "Well then," me agreed, and poured them both a small glass of apple brandy. The courtship was, as Cyrus had promised, proper and attentive. He brought her wildflowers, not once but often, small bunches of the prairie flowers that bloomed stubbornly in the dry heat, the yellow ones and the delicate purple ones, the kind you had to look for but that were everywhere when you looked. He walked with her on Sunday afternoons, out along the creek that ran east of town in the shade of the cottonwoods, where the water was low and clear, and the willows trailed their fingers in it. He took her to the church social in July and danced with her twice. He was not a particularly graceful dancer, but he was an attentive one, which mattered considerably more, and Mrs. Tanner at the general store looked so pleased about it that she gave me an extra measure of coffee beans the next morning. He was also simply there in the daily fabric of things, present, steady, increasingly woven into the life of the house, and the town in the way that someone who is genuinely putting roots down becomes woven. He was known at the livery and the blacksmith and the general store. He had nodded greetings with Judge Preston, and had apparently said something to the old judge's satisfaction, because Preston told me one day in passing that her boarder seemed like a man of good sense, which from Preston was essentially a declaration of approval. He took the Halloran foreman work seriously and was good at it. The hands at the ranch responded well to him, me heard, because he was fair and knowledgeable, and had the particular kind of authority that comes not from demanding it but from demonstrating it in the course of events. Bill Halloran was pleased with him by all accounts. Me, for her part, was simply happy. It was a straightforward, uncomplicated happiness of the kind that comes when a thing that has been uncertain resolves itself into certainty, when a person who has been hoped for is present and real and choosing to be there. She was happy in a way that colored everything. The morning coffee, the garden in the early light, the sound of voices at the supper table, the evenings on the porch with the man who was sitting beside her without his boots on. He had, after the first evening of boot removing, stopped wearing them to bed. She gathered this from the consistent sound of them each night, and had begun leaving them on the mat beside the door of his room, and she found that detail quietly and disproportionately moving every time she passed it. On an August evening, he asked her to marry him. They were at the creek, where they had walked most Sundays through the summer, sitting on the bank in the last of the afternoon light where the cottonwoods threw long shadows across the water. It had been a good walk and a good conversation, and then they had gone quiet in the way they did, comfortably, the two of them watching the water move. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I've thought about it very carefully, not because I'm uncertain, but because a thing this important deserves to be properly considered." Me looked at him. She was very still. "I want to marry you," he said. He had turned to face her fully, and his expression was the most openly earnest she had ever seen it, no composure for composure's sake, nothing held back or guarded, just the plain truth of him. "I want to build something with you. I want to wake up in the same place every morning and have that place be where you are. I want to plant things that take years to grow because I intend to be there to see them grow." He paused. "I want to take my boots off every night because there is somewhere worth staying." Me felt her throat tighten with something warm and full. "Me," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him in the late August light, at the man who had ridden into town on a worn horse with a single saddlebag, and a conviction that nowhere was worth staying, who had been undone slowly and thoroughly by a kitchen garden and a porch, and the fact that she had asked him a simple question and listened to the answer. "Yes," she said, "I will absolutely marry you." He kissed her there by the creek in the long evening light, and the cottonwood leaves moved overhead in the warm wind, and somewhere up the creek a sandpiper called, and the world seemed to me to be arranged exactly as it ought to be. They were married in September in the small Baptist church with the cracked bell, which had, it turned out, been repaired by Cyrus and the Reverend Dokes the week before the wedding, because it seemed wrong for the bell not to ring. It rang. The whole town came, because the whole town had been watching this particular story and felt invested in its conclusion. Mae wore a dress of deep blue, the color of the sky just before dark when it goes rich and full, a dress that Clara had helped her let out and take in to fit properly, altered from the bolt of good wool she had been saving for an occasion worth saving it for. Cyrus wore a clean dark coat that he had bought from the dry goods store, and he had actually visited the barber, and he looked so entirely himself and so entirely present that Mae, walking down the short aisle with her hand through Clara's arm, felt something enormous rise in her chest. Clara, who gave her away because there was nobody else, and because she was entirely the right person to do it, squeezed her hand once when they stopped at the front of the church, and whispered, "Your mother would have liked him." And Mae blinked hard twice, and then composed herself because she was going to get through this ceremony with her dignity intact even if it required considerable effort. Cyrus was looking at her with a look that made the considerable effort worthwhile. The Reverend Dokes performed the ceremony with warm simplicity, and when the time came for the vows, Cyrus said his with a steady voice and eyes that never moved from her face, and when he said, "I will stay," not part of the standard vows, but something he had clearly added something in Mae's composure gave up, and she let one tear go and then brought things back under control through sheer force of will. She said her own vows clearly and truly, and then they were married, and the cracked bell that was no longer cracked rang out over Dusty Creek in the September morning, and the small congregation cheered, and Clara produced her embroidered handkerchief, and wept with the uninhibited emotion she had apparently been storing for decades. That evening, after the celebration, which involved a considerable quantity of food at the boarding house, and dancing in the street outside because the parlor was not large enough, and old Mr. Beaumont delivering a lengthy and surprisingly touching toast, Mae and Cyrus sat on the porch that was now entirely their porch, in the quiet after the guests had gone, in the particular piece of a day that has been everything a day can be. He had his arm around her and she was leaning into his side, and the stars were out in full force the way they are in the Texas fall when the air turns clear. "Are you happy?" she asked, not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to hear him say it. "Yes," he said. "Completely." She tipped her head back to look up at the stars, and felt the weight of his arm around her, and felt the quality of the evening, the porch, the garden quiet in the dark, the horses in the stable, the house behind them, the life that was theirs, and felt an enormous contented certainty about all of it. The autumn passed with the comfortable busyness of two people making a life that is genuinely being made rather than merely maintained. The fall roundup at the Halloran Ranch was demanding work, and Cyrus was gone for long days and sometimes overnight. But he came back every time, which was the obvious and natural thing, but which also, every time, made something in Mae's chest feel warm in a way she did not try to suppress, because she had decided she was done suppressing things that felt warm. She had begun to think about the boarding house differently. Clara was getting older, not frail, not by any means. Clara Fitch was a formidable woman and showed every intention of remaining one. But she had spoken once or twice about how the running of the house was more physical work than it used to be, how the years were making themselves apparent in certain joints. Mae and Cyrus talked about it one evening and agreed together that it made sense to think about the long term, about what the house needed to be as things changed. What they settled on, over the course of several good long conversations, was this: they would keep the boarding house running, because it was the house, and because Dusty Creek needed it, but they would begin to think of it as their home first and a business second. They would take only long-term boarders, people who wanted somewhere genuine to be, not just a bed for a night. Clara would remain a part of it as long as she wanted, and her room was hers for as long as she lived, which Mae stated with a firmness that she could see moved Clara considerably. They began, that fall, to add to the house. Not extravagantly, this was practical country, and there was no money for excess. But the lean-to at the back became a proper addition, a room with good windows that looked out over the kitchen garden and caught the morning light. Cyrus built most of it himself, on days off from the ranch, with the help of Samuel Kendrick, who had come back through town with his brother and been persuaded to stay for the winter in exchange for his labor. Mae planted a fruit tree beside the back fence, a peach tree, small and bare and hopeful, which the nursery man in Amarillo had said would take 2 or 3 years to bear fruit. She planted it with the feeling of someone who intends to be there in 2 or 3 years to see the fruit, which was itself a kind of profound statement. In November, Mae realized she was expecting a child. She told Cyrus on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen, where he was mending a piece of harness and she was sitting across the table from him. She said it quietly and directly, the way she said most things, and watched his face. He put down the harness. He looked at her. For a moment his face was entirely still, processing, and then something happened to it that she had never seen before, something that was larger than his usual expressions, something that took up all the space of his face and went past it into his eyes and the set of his shoulders and the whole posture of him. He got up from the table and came to her and put his arms around her very carefully, as if she were something that required extraordinary care, and held on. She could feel him breathing deep and slow and deliberate, the way you breathe when something is so large you need to give it room. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. "Our baby," he said, with a kind of wondering quietness. "Ours," she said. He pulled back and looked at her face with those dark eyes, and the expression in them was the most complete and open thing she had ever seen from him, joy and wonder and a deep fierce quality of love that was not the careful restrained kind but the full kind, the kind that has given up on protecting itself. "I did not think," he said slowly, "that this was something I would have." "What do you mean?" "A family," he said. "A home, someone to all of this. I had stopped thinking this was something that happened to me." Mae took his face in her hands. "It is," she said. "It's happening to you." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, and she felt the warmth of it go all the way through her. Clara was told at breakfast the next morning, and responded by immediately beginning to plan for the conversion of the small sitting room off the kitchen into a proper nursery, with such efficient certainty that it was clear she had been expecting this news for some time, and had simply been waiting for it to become official. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold but dry, and the boarding house was warm, and Cyrus was there every evening when he came back from the ranch, and the room at the end of the hall, his old room, which was now the room they were turning into the nursery, had been given new purpose, and life had an ordered and purposeful quality that Mae found deeply satisfying. She had spent a long time keeping things going, sustaining things, and now she was building something, and the difference between sustaining and building felt significant and good. She watched Cyrus through those winter months and saw the continued slow opening of him, the way a person who has been held closed for years gradually, through the sustained warmth of being genuinely loved and genuinely in a place, unclenches. He laughed more easily. He talked more, not that he ever became loquacious. He was by nature a man of carefully chosen words, but there were more of them, and they were more personal. He told her stories about his childhood in Arkansas that she could tell he had not told anyone in years, small stories, daily stories, the kind about the texture of an ordinary life before it went wrong, the smell of his mother's kitchen, the sound his father made when he found something funny, the way the creek on their farm ran over a particular rock formation that made a sound like music in spring. She loved those stories. She told him her own, her father's hands, big and careful, her mother's laugh, which had been high and surprised, as if joy always caught her off guard, The year Mee had kept a crow as a pet because it had a broken wing, and had refused to leave after the wing healed, and had become a fixture of the yard until it finally decided to go, which had been treated as a genuine bereavement by her 12-year-old self. In these exchanges, she felt, they were giving each other something that couldn't be given in any other way, the selves they had been before loss, the people who existed underneath the coping. And those people, she discovered, were very fond of each other. In March of 1879, their son was born. The birth was attended by Dr. Harwell, who had recently settled in Dusty Creek and was a considerable improvement on the previous arrangements, and by Clara, who had attended more births than the doctor and knew it, and made this diplomatically but clearly known. It was a long night and not an easy one, but Mee was fundamentally determined and her body was sound, and by morning she was exhausted and gloriously fine, and there was a small solid person in her arms. Cyrus had spent the night in the kitchen, which was where she had told him to go, and Clara had kept him supplied with coffee and information at intervals. When Clara came out at dawn and said, "Come in now," he came through the door into the bedroom where Mee was propped against the pillows with the small wrapped bundle, and the look on his face when he crossed the room to her was something Mee knew she would carry with her every day for the rest of her life. He sat on the edge of the bed, very careful, and looked at the baby red-faced and small-fisted and entirely certain of his right to exist, which he had demonstrated through the previous night with considerable volume. "He's perfect," Cyrus said, in a voice that was not quite steady. "He's quite loud," Mee said, "but yes." Cyrus very carefully put a finger against the baby's hand, and the baby's hand reflexively, instinctively, with the total confidence of the newly arrived, closed around it. Cyrus looked up at me. His eyes were bright. "What shall we name him?" he asked. They had discussed names over the preceding months with great seriousness and varying results. They had agreed on nothing, or rather they had agreed on several things and then changed their minds, which was the same as agreeing on nothing. "I thought Thomas," Mee said. "Thomas after your uncle." Cyrus looked at her. He was quiet for a long moment. "He would have liked that very much," he said at last. "Thomas Hadley then," Mee said. "Tom." "Tom," Cyrus agreed, and looked at the baby with an expression of such absolute complete love that Mee felt her chest do the enormous undisciplined thing again, and let it. Tom was a good baby, by which Mee meant a healthy and lively one, not a quiet one, because he had clearly inherited her propensity for communication, and he communicated his views loudly and frequently. He grew with the enthusiastic speed of a well-fed child in a warm house, and was sat up by 5 months, and was pulling himself around the kitchen floor by 9, and was a considerable source of fascination to the boarders and to everyone in Dusty Creek who encountered him. Cyrus was entirely devoted to him in the quiet, practical, total way. He was devoted to things he loved. He would carry Tom through the kitchen garden in the mornings, pointing at things with the serious attention of someone conducting an important lesson, while Tom ate this information with the delighted seriousness of a very small person for whom everything is both new and reasonable. He built Tom a cradle of such careful and handsome craftsmanship that Mr. Beaumont, who had opinions about woodwork among other things, declared it the finest piece of furniture in Dusty Creek, and was probably right. The boarding house, through 1879 and into 1880, settled into a life that Mee could best describe as full. Full in the way that a house properly used is full with work and with warmth, and with the comings and goings of people, with the smells of food and coffee and fresh wood from the addition and earth from the garden. Clara presided over all of it with her characteristic mixture of warmth and efficiency, and was clearly thriving in the role of grandmother in residence, a role she had not been offered before, and had apparently been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Cyrus's work at the Halloran Ranch had extended into a permanent position, and with it came a degree of stability and recognition that was new to him, and which Mee watched him receive with a kind of moved attention. He was known and trusted in this town. He was someone people stopped to talk to on Main Street, someone whose opinion was sought about cattle and weather, and the various practical concerns of life in the Panhandle. He had neighbors who knew his name and meant something by it. One Saturday afternoon in the fall of 1880, Mae was in the garden harvesting the last of the season's beans when she heard Cyrus come out the back door. Tom toddled after him, having recently achieved reliable walking and treating this new power with enormous satisfaction. Cyrus lifted Tom up onto his shoulders, and Tom grabbed his father's hat and pulled it sideways, and Cyrus righted it without fuss. He came to stand at the edge of the garden, Tom on his shoulders, and looked out at the rows of beans and the last of the tomatoes and the peach tree, which was, as promised by the nurseryman, beginning to show the early signs of what would next year be fruit. "Me," he said. She looked up. "I want to say something to you," he said. She waited, hands full of bean pods, looking at her husband and her son against the blue October sky. "I rode into this town 2 years ago," he said, "with a saddlebag and 8 years of nothing I wanted to go back to. I was going to stay a few days and move on." He paused. "I had not taken my boots off in 6 months. I didn't see the point." She was very still, listening. "You asked me why," he said, "and I told you the truth that there was nowhere worth staying. And you listened to me say that, and you didn't argue with me, and you didn't tell me I was wrong. He stopped. You just kept being the kind of person worth staying for, and the kind of place worth staying in, and you let me arrive at it myself." He adjusted his hold on Tom, who was eating the brim of his hat. "I just want you to know that I know exactly what was given to me when I rode into this town. I know exactly what I have, and I'm never going to take it for granted." Mae stood in her garden with beans in her hands and felt something enormous and complete and right move through her. "Cyrus Hadley," she said. "Mae Hadley," he said. "Come help me with these beans," she said, "and then we'll sit on the porch and you can tell me all about what you know." He laughed that full and loosened laugh that still delighted her every time, and came into the garden and took the beans she handed him and carried Tom on one arm while he did it. And the afternoon was golden, and the air smelled of earth and autumn, and the particular good smell of a life well underway. That winter, Mae told him she was expecting again. This time he was not sitting in the kitchen but standing in the barn with a harness in his hands, and he went so still for a moment that she thought she might have broken him. And then he set the harness down very carefully and turned around, and his face was that same enormous open expression, the one that could not hold anything back, the one that was her favorite of all his faces. He crossed the barn in 3 steps and kissed her, warmly and thoroughly, and then rested his forehead against hers. "Two," he said. "Two," she confirmed. "Tom is going to have opinions about this," he said. "Tom has opinions about everything," she said. "He comes by it honestly." He laughed against her hair. Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1881, in June, when the days were long and the garden was in full riot. She arrived more quickly and less dramatically than Tom had, with the confidence of a person who knows what she is about, and she was small and dark-haired, and had Cyrus's eyes, that deep brown that was almost black, and had apparently arrived with a very precise sense of what she wanted and a clear intent to communicate it. They named her Ellen, after Mae's mother, and Cyrus spent a long time holding her in the evening light and looking at her with the particular expression of a man who cannot believe his good fortune and is not certain what to do about it except to stay very still and let it be real. Tom, 18 months old and in possession of the whole world as far as he was concerned, adjusted to Ellen with initial suspicion followed by devoted interest, which included attempting to share his breakfast with her when she was 3 weeks old and not yet equipped to participate in breakfast sharing, and had to be redirected, but the intent was good. Life in the boarding house settled around the 4 of them, and Clara, and the steady rotation of long-term boarders. A schoolteacher named Miss Palmer who had come to take the position at Dusty Creek's new school. A quiet man named Albrecht who did assaying work for one of the mines north of town and was there most of the year. And the occasional traveler passing through, though Mae was selective about these now. Less about money and more about the character of the house. The peach tree bore fruit that summer, the first real fruit. Not many but real, small and warm, and intensely sweet the way the first fruit of a tree always is. Mae picked one on a July morning and bit into it, standing in the garden with the baby on her hip and Tom at her feet inspecting a beetle with great concentration, and the sweetness of it was so complete and so entirely itself that she stood there for a moment and let it be everything. Cyrus found her there. He had come back from the ranch early. Something had freed up an afternoon, a rare thing, and he came through the garden gate and stopped when he saw her face. "What?" he asked. "The peach tree," she said, and held the rest of the fruit out to him. He took it and ate it. He looked at the tree. He looked at her. He was quiet for a moment in the particularly full way he was quiet when he was feeling something large. "We planted that tree together," he said. "You helped me dig the hole," she said. I remember thinking I had no idea if I would be here when it bore fruit. No idea at all. And," she said. He looked around the garden, the neat rows, the beans climbing their twine, the peas gone now and the tomatoes in, the big sunflowers along the fence that Tom had wanted planted because he had seen a picture of one, and then at Tom, who had moved on from the beetle to poking at the earth with a stick, and then at Ellen on Mae's hip, and then at me. "And here I am," he said. She stepped forward and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, Ellen between them making small, interested sounds about the garden. And the July sun was warm on all of them, and the peach tree stood at the edge of the fence promising more fruit the following year and the year after that, as things that have found their ground do. The years moved forward the way good years do, not without difficulty, because life in the Panhandle in the 1880s was not without its hard things, its droughts and its market troubles and its distances and its losses, and there were years that were harder than others, years when the cattle prices were low and the rain was scarce and money was careful. But they moved through those things together, Mae and Cyrus, with the practical steadiness of people who have decided where they are and intend to stay there and work with what they have. Tom grew into a boy with his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was a useful combination, and was mad for horses from the age of 4, which made his father quietly proud. Ellen grew into a small person with precise and strong opinions and remarkable dark eyes, and a laugh that was high and surprised, like joy always caught her off guard, which reminded me so much of her own mother that it was sometimes a sweet ache and sometimes pure joy, and usually both at once. In 1883, they added another room to the house, a proper room this time, well built, with good windows and a view of the garden. It was a room for Clara, who had decided that the climb to her second-floor room was no longer to her taste, and who moved into the new downstairs room with the contentment of someone who has been looked after in the exact right way. In 1884, when Tom was 5 and Ellen was 3, Mae found herself expecting again. She told Cyrus on the porch on a September evening, and he received the news with the same expression he had always received it, enormous and open and thoroughly undone by love, and said, "3," in a tone of deep wonderment. "3," Mae confirmed. "We are going to need another room," he said. "You are very good at building rooms," she said. He laughed and pulled her close, and they sat on the porch in the September evening while the crickets called in the dry grass, and the stars came out one by one over Dusty Creek, and the house behind them was warm and full and entirely, permanently theirs. Their second son arrived in the spring of 1885, healthy and loud and immediately interested in everything, and they named him Samuel, after Samuel Kendrick, who had helped build half the house and who had become over the years something like family, and he was fair-haired where the others were dark, and had Mae's eyes, and was from his first weeks a person of great energy and cheerful determination. The boarding house continued, and the ranch work continued, and the garden continued, and the children grew, and the peach tree bore fruit every summer and was joined eventually by an apple tree and a plum tree. Because if you are going to plant a tree in the knowledge that you will see it bear fruit, you might as well plant several. Clara Fitch, in the autumn of 1886, turned 70 years old, and the town of Dusty Creek, which had come to regard her with the particular collective affection reserved for formidable women of long standing, celebrated this with a party on the boarding-house porch that extended well into the evening, and involved a quantity of food and music, and the Reverend Dokes delivering a toast of such warmth and length that it became briefly its own entertainment. Clara sat in her chair on the porch and received all of this with the composed satisfaction of someone who has done things worth celebrating and knows it. Me sat beside her, and at some point in the evening Clara took her hand and held it. "Your parents would be very proud," Clara said. Me looked out at the street, at the lanterns strung for the party, at Cyrus standing with Bill Halloran and Judge Preston talking about something that made them all laugh, at Tom running with the other children in the lamplight, at Ellen sitting on the front step with Samuel, explaining something to him with tremendous authority. "I know they would," Me said. She squeezed Clara's hand. "Thank you for all of it." "You did the work," Clara said. "I just kept the coffee on." On a quiet evening in November of that same year, Cyrus came home from the ranch to find me in the kitchen with supper ready, and the children variously occupied. Tom doing something elaborate with wooden blocks, Ellen reading with the focused seriousness of a 6-year-old who has recently discovered the full power of books, Samuel asleep in his corner, as he was most evenings at this point. Cyrus stood in the kitchen doorway and took in all of this, the warm kitchen, the smell of supper, the particular noise and light of an occupied family home, with the same quiet attention he had always brought to things. Me looked up from the stove. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he said. He came in and kissed her, and then he went and sat down beside Tom and looked at the block construction with the seriousness it deserved, and Tom began explaining it at length, and Ellen looked up from her book to deliver a brief addendum, and Samuel slept on peacefully in his corner, entirely content with the world. Me turned back to the stove, and the kitchen was warm and full of voices, and outside the November wind moved through the cottonwood tree in the side yard with a sound like something settling. Later, after supper, after the children were in bed, after Clara had retired with her embroidery, Cyrus and me sat on the porch as they had sat on 1,000 evenings, or what felt like 1,000, which was really only 9 years of evenings. But 9 years of evenings with the right person has a quality of depth that makes it feel like longer and also feels like no time at all. His boots were off. They were beside the door, had been beside the door every evening for 9 years, since a few days after he had told her there was nowhere worth staying, and had then arrived at the understanding that he was wrong. The stars were out. The November air was cold and clean. Me had a blanket across her knees and Cyrus had his arm around her, and the street was quiet and the town was dark and the house behind them was full of all the people who made it a home. "Are you happy?" she asked him, as she had asked him the night they were married, because she had liked his answer then and went on liking it. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of uncertainty, but the quiet of a man who is actually checking, who is genuinely looking at the thing being asked and making certain his answer is true. "Yes," he said, "completely." She leaned in against him and felt the solid realness of him, and felt the house behind them, and felt the sleeping weight of the life they had built, the garden and the trees and the rooms and the children and the years, and felt it all settle around her like something permanent, like the kind of thing that grows roots so deep that nothing can pull them up. Out on the street, a horse somewhere nickered in the dark. The cottonwood moved. The stars went on overhead, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the way they always had above this stretch of panhandle land, above all the people who had ever lived here and loved here and stayed. Cyrus Hadley's boots were beside the door. He had found somewhere worth staying, and Mae Morgan, who had grown her garden and kept her house and asked a quiet question on a warm night and listened to the answer Mae Morgan, who was Mae Hadley now and had been for 9 years. She had always known that he would, once he arrived at it, stay forever. She had known it from the beginning. She had planted the peach tree knowing it. And in the spring, it would bear fruit again, as it had every spring since they planted it, this small faithful tree. This thing they had put in the ground together in the belief that they would be there to see it grow, which they were, which they always were, which they would be for all the years that remained to them, which were many and good and entirely, permanently theirs.